Hey everyone, before we explore today's story, a big thanks to today's sponsor Skillshare. Skillshare is an amazing online community where you can explore new skills, develop existing interests, and get lost in creativity. With thousands of excellent courses, there is something for everyone, with topics ranging from lifestyle, productivity, entrepreneurship, and so much more. A course I am loving at the moment is Productivity for Creatives. Build a system that brings out your best by Thomas Frank, which is helping me to be efficient in my creative work and on YouTube. Whether you're a dabbler, a hobbyist, or a master, Skillshare is where you need to be. Make sure to check it out as soon as you can, because the first 1,000 people who use the link in my description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare Premium. Hey everyone, today we are looking into the life of Wenxiu, a young girl who became the secondary consort or junior wife of the last emperor of China, Emperor Puyi, when she married him in 1922 when she was just 12 years of age. But her life within the imperial household became highly problematic owing to a range of external political issues and internal personal problems within the palace. Here we explore what happened to her. Wenxiu was born on the 20th of December 1909 in Beijing as a member of the Urdet clan and of the Manchu bordered Yellow Banner. The family was high-ranking within the Outer Mongolian nobility, but less so within the wider hierarchy of Qing China's aristocracy. Her father was Duan Gong, a mid-ranking figure at the Qing imperial court in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Wenxiu's courtesy name was Hui Xing, though once she began attending school, she was given the name Fu Yunfang to make her sound more Chinese. Outer Mongolia, from which the Urdet clan originated, was part of Qing China at the time, though its people retained their own culture and efforts were constantly underway to make families such as Wenxiu's more Chinese by giving them Chinese names and by imposing Chinese manners. At school, she was excelling, but as we will see, her time in standard education would be cut very short before she even entered her teenage years. Much of the course of her life was tied in with the tumultuous political landscape of China during the first half of the 20th century. At the time of Wenxiu's birth, China and with it Outer Mongolia and Manchuria in the northeast of the country were experiencing profound change. The vast nation had been ruled by the Qing dynasty since the middle of the 17th century, but it had steadily weakened since the early 19th century, as Britain and then other Western powers began intervening in the country's affairs. Although China largely maintained its political independence, from the 1870s onwards, it was under increasing pressure from its eastern neighbour Japan, which, following the so-called Meiji Restoration of the 1860s, had modernised and adopted Western military and political methods very quickly. Soon, the emerging Empire of Japan was making its presence felt on the Korean peninsula, and in 1894, a brief war, the first Sino-Japanese War, even broke out between Japan and China, one which saw Japan replace China as the predominant power in the Yellow Sea. Thus, by the time that Wenxiu was born, China's position in East Asia and its relationship with Japan was becoming increasingly precarious. This unrest in foreign affairs augmented China's domestic problems. Since the late 19th century, there had been a mass movement within the country to initiate wide-ranging social and political reforms. Then in 1908, a new emperor, the Emperor Puyi, succeeded when he was just 2 years old. The accession of a child who could not be able to rule in his own right for well over 10 years was a disaster for China at this precarious point in history. As a consequence of it, in 1911, A huge rising against the government swept across much of China. Within weeks, the Qing dynasty ended, and the infant Puyi was deposed in the first stages of a long and bitter civil war which would last in one form or another in China until 1949. Wenxiu's life would be characterized by the beginning and end of that same civil war. Although a Republic of China had been declared in 1911, and the Chinese Empire was brought to an end, the child Emperor Puyi was allowed to retain his titles and privileges in China, albeit in an entirely honorific and ceremonial capacity. In 1921, the last emperor, having turned 15, determined to marry. In the Forbidden City, in the heart of Beijing, he was presented with photos of 5 candidates who had been pre-selected by the upper echelons of the palace administrators. These candidates were of a comparable age to Puyi and generally hailed from amongst the Chinese nobility. Wenxiu was among them and favoured by certain groups at court. However, her contention was opposed by others on account of her Outer Mongolian heritage. As a result, Puyi eventually selected and married Wanrong in 1922, a member of the Manchurian nobility, who became the Empress Wanrong. Yet, in keeping with the Chinese imperial customs, Puyi also married Wenxiu the same year, making her his imperial consort, a kind of officially acknowledged mistress or second wife at the imperial court. The years ahead were difficult. For starters, Wenxiu was just 12 years of age when she married the 16-year-old emperor Puyi. But the major issue for the consort was the bizarre ménage à trois which she found herself in with Puyi and Wanrong. Jealousies developed between the empress and the imperial consort from very early on, and these would persist on and off for years to come. Much of the problem stemmed from Puyi himself, a retiring, difficult character who hardly had enough energy to bestow attention on one wife, let alone 2. As her teenage years progressed in the Forbidden City, Wenxiu would grow increasingly lonely and isolated, while Wanrong also suffered, gradually developing an addiction to opiates, which would become chronic over time. All of this was compounded by the fact that neither Wanrong or Wenxiu produced any children with Puyi. A quote from one of Wenxiu's diaries around this time, which was quoted by Puyi much later in a memoir he wrote, epitomizes her feelings at this time. Here she stated, "The doe trapped in the garden is like a person locked in a prison, who, unless there is a general pardon, will find no freedom." She was speaking of herself as the doe. Furthermore, Wanrong couldn't put up with the fact that Puyi had another wife, and thus she would often mock and insult the younger Wenxiu. To get a better glimpse of her time in the Forbidden City, we can look at one of Wenxiu's accounts where she states that there was a generator in the palace, but it often broke down and it was common to have power failure. Puyi didn't live with his empress or his consort, so I had to live alone in the spacious Changchun palace. The nights were so long and so horrible, and the loneliness in my heart was hard to get rid of. I lit a candle and faced the lonely lamp, waiting until the candle was burned most. When the wick became longer and the light shadow began to swing, I would take a pair of scissors to cut the wick shorter. A spell of indescribable mawkishness ran through me, and I thought I was just like this half-burned candle, whose tears would run out soon, and whose life would be turned into a smoke. Was this really a palace of magnificence? Maybe it was just a macabre grave. Yet, her situation only got worse. In October 1924, following an escalation of the civil unrest throughout China, Power in Beijing was seized by an army commander by the name of Feng Yujiang. Just weeks later, he exiled Puyi and with him the imperial household, including Wenxiu, to Tianjin, on the coast of the Yellow Sea to the southeast of Beijing. By 1924, this was a Japanese concession, lands which the Chinese government had effectively ceded to Japan as a price of avoiding a full-scale war that China could not hope to win. It was here that Wenxiu would spend her remaining years as imperial consort. To an outside observer, Wenxiu's life at Tianjin was hardly difficult. The imperials, although powerless from a political standpoint, had no material needs, and both the empress and the imperial consort were able to purchase nearly whatever they wanted, and were even able to bring in the latest European fashions to Tianjin. Yet life at the concession had become increasingly difficult for Wenxiu. While Puyi and Wanrong grew somewhat closer over time in the second half of the 1920s, the emperor increasingly ignored his consort in a very literal sense. Although living in the same building, sometimes she would go significant periods of time without interacting with her husband on any level. In the letter to a cousin of hers from this time, she stated that, "Years I have been treated as non-human." Here she also describes her room as a prison, and the court as full of individuals who treated her as a backwoods provincial who did not understand imperial etiquette. Unsurprisingly, Wenxiu's mental welfare had suffered dramatically. She consequently attempted suicide on several occasions. For instance, one night the emperor and Wanrong were celebrating a Chinese festival in Tianjin. Meanwhile, she had been left in her apartment alone, so the imperial consort attempted to end her life by stabbing herself with a large pair of scissors. But on this occasion, her life was saved by the intervention of a eunuch. Wenxiu was a woman who had just turned 20, but clearly deeply unhappy and extremely alone. Clearly, something had to change, otherwise, a long life in these miserable circumstances could be her fate. In the autumn of 1931, the Japanese government exploited the ongoing domestic unrest within China to expand its influence on the Asian mainland by invading Manchuria. Within a very short period of time, the northeastern region of China, straddling the borders of Korea and Russia, was brought under Japanese control, and a puppet state named Manchukuo was established here to give the region some semblance of independence. But in reality, a huge part of China was now ruled from Tokyo. The Japanese authorities subsequently installed Puyi as the new emperor of Manchukuo and Wanrong as empress. But Wenxiu was already gone by that time. By 1931, her despair and suicidal ideation at her circumstances in Tianjin had hardened into a firm resolve to escape her circumstances. Thus, it was on the 25th of August 1931, just weeks before the Japanese invaded Manchuria, that the imperial consort had made a highly unusual decision in Chinese imperial politics. She left the palace at Tianjin on this day and indicated that she wanted a divorce from the emperor. Although divorce was practiced widely enough in China by the early 1930s, it was unheard of for an imperial wife to leave an emperor. Having initiated proceedings, Wenxiu consequently found herself being attacked by the Chinese media. Articles appeared in newspapers in Beijing and other major cities which criticized her, accusing her of being ungrateful, immoral, and shameless. Many of her own relatives shunned her and tried to coerce her into returning to Puyi, though her sister Wenxiu was a great supporter. Despite the widespread opposition from her extended family, the imperial court and Chinese society as a whole, Wenxiu remained committed to her decision. Wenxiu, however, did not have to wait long for the matter to be resolved. Puyi considered the issue to be an embarrassing controversy, which needed to be ended as soon as possible. Thus, when his lawyers and those of his wife met in the weeks that followed, they were quickly able to work out an agreement which was finalized on the 13th of September 1931. Through this, Puyi and Wenxiu's marriage was terminated. Both sides would remain silent about their union in order to avoid further reputational damage to either Wenxiu's extended family or the majesty of the imperial family. Finally, Puyi would pay Wenxiu 50,000 yuan as a lifetime alimony. The now former imperial consort returned to Beijing following the finalization of the divorce. Here she lived a relatively quiet life in the years that followed as a teacher in a primary school. We know little about what she did during the tumultuous years following the invasion of China by Japan in 1937 and the wider outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. Conversely, Puyi and Wanrong would remain as the puppet rulers of Manchukuo until the end of the Second World War in 1945. Wanrong would die from severe malnutrition and opium withdrawals just months after the liberation of the country in 1945. Meanwhile, Puyi was tried and convicted of being a war criminal in the Tokyo trials, which were the trials held for Japanese and Allied war criminals in Tokyo after the end of the war, for which he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Given this, Wenxiu's decision to divorce Puyi just weeks before the imperial court was moved to Manchukuo seems like a very fortunate choice. In 1947, as the Chinese Civil War, which had started way back in 1911, was entering its final stages, Wenxiu married Major Liu Shengdong in Beijing. He had been a soldier when they met towards the end of the Second World War, but had subsequently retired and opened a car rental business. This ran into financial trouble, and in the years that followed, the pair ran a number of small businesses, one being a cleaning service, and the other manufacturing wood pallets. It was a poverty-stricken life for a woman who a quarter of a century earlier had lived in the imperial palace within the Forbidden City in Beijing. Perhaps their lack of money did not allow her to get proper medical treatment when health issues arose for Wenxiu in the early 1950s, when she was still just in her early 40s. It was a result of these that she died quite young on the 17th of September 1953, at the age of 43, most likely from a myocardial infarction or heart attack. Without money to purchase a coffin, her husband constructed one himself, and it was in this that the last imperial consort of China was buried in the Andingmen district of Beijing several days later. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Wenxiu. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave me a like and a comment down below. And if you're new, why not subscribe? If you have any suggestions, be sure to leave them in the comments, or you can also message me on Instagram or to my email, which are both in the description. I hope you have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as they're uploaded. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.